Welcome to LSAT Unplugged.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for joining. So I was really hoping to get your take, the insider's view on what the LSAT accommodations process looks like, what applicants need to know, whether they have a physical issue or maybe a mental or timing issue. Could you share a little bit about what that process looks like, just walking us through it?
Sure. So my caveat would be that for people that have physical problems, these are definitely issues that a person would want to request an accommodation for, depending on what the issue is. I myself am a psychologist, so I don't evaluate people with physical problems. So if you have a broken leg or if you're pregnant and you need to have certain accommodations, those are very legitimate things. But the issues that I really see mostly are people that have difficulties with things like ADHD, where they have a deficit in their ability to maintain attention or their ability to sit and focus for long periods of time. I also see people who have learning disabilities, which basically means that they're not able to work as quickly or function as efficiently as they would need to in order to perform to their capability on the LSAT. And then also I see a lot of people who have things like anxiety and depression issues. And when those issues are pretty severe, they can substantially impede a person's performance. So those are the three different areas that I really work with most frequently. In terms of requesting accommodations, a person has to be able to register for the LSAT, and then after they do that, they can submit documentation. They need to meet with a person like me who's able to do what's called a psychoeducational evaluation. And that evaluation is going to include an analysis of their life history, their educational history. It's going to look at the different symptoms that they're experiencing at the present time, their history of experiencing those symptoms, and then I offer a diagnosis and recommendations. And there are times that I recommend accommodations, and if so, then that person can use the report I've written and fill out some other forms off the LSAC website, and that becomes the basis of an accommodations petition.
Thank you so much for breaking that down so clearly. I guess the question that naturally arises is, for an applicant, when do they know, how do they know whether they should seek accommodations or not? Because it seems to me that sometimes some of these criteria are a little bit hazy. A lot of people have difficulty focusing, especially on something as boring as the LSAT. And so how do you know whether your issues might warrant extra time?
Well, that's a good question. So, the student themselves is not going to be able to know before they meet with a professional whether or not they meet criteria for having a quote-unquote disability that would require an accommodation. Some people might know if they've had a history and they've already been tested before. Let's say when they were a kid, they were evaluated and they've been already receiving accommodations. If that's the case, then they might already know that fact. But testing also has to be done within a 5-year time span. So I see a lot of people who have that history. They need to be evaluated again because the testing is old. Now, for the category of people that think that they might have something going on, but they're not sure, these are people that are going to notice things in not only when they're taking a sample LSAT, but they're going to notice things in their daily life too. So for someone who, let's say it's an ADHD kind of an issue, that's not going to be something that's arising just when the LSAT rolls around. That's going to be a person that's had these types of issues focusing for, basically their whole life. And let's take the issue of a learning disability. That too is going to be something where a person has experienced difficulty with, let's say, efficiency while reading, being able to read quickly enough while also understanding the information. They're going to notice that they've had a history of that. The issue around, let's say, a mental disorder like an anxiety disorder or a depressive disorder, these are issues that actually could come up more recently because a person doesn't need to have a history of those symptoms dating back their whole life. Sometimes a person has a traumatic incident that happens. Sometimes they develop anxiety or depression after, a bad relationship or something has happened in their lives that stimulates that. So, usually if you're anxious or depressed, you know that you're feeling that way, but you really need the evaluation to determine not only whether you have the diagnosis, but whether your symptoms hinder you substantially enough in order to require an accommodation. So meeting with a professional, someone who does what I do, is necessary in order to make that final call.
Well, that's really interesting because I hear a lot about ADHD for accommodations. I get a lot of students asking me about that, but I didn't know that anxiety and depression were areas that LSAC might grant accommodations. Is that something that you've been seeing quite a bit of?
Yeah, I see that a lot. And, I think these days people are probably more kind of stressed out or pressured than ever. Aside from the LSAT, I see that a lot when I meet with people that are still in high school. A lot of these kids are under intense pressure. And the same thing happens with the LSAT, where people feel like, they want to get into a certain law school, or it's very, very competitive. And in any area that's competitive, if you're a person predisposed to feeling pressured or placing a lot of pressure on oneself, you can end up kind of developing an anxiety or depression. And it's certainly not the case with any of these diagnoses. It's certainly not the case that everyone with ADHD or everyone with a learning disorder or everyone with anxiety or depression needs accommodation. So that's not the case. It's the issue of, do your symptoms hinder you in a way that prevents you from being able to perform to the level that you're capable of? So if the answer to that question is yes, then you are a person that will have a pretty good chance and should actually have accommodations. And the underlying issue of why you would need accommodations really could be any number of things, but we always come back to that issue: is, are you being hindered substantially enough in order to require these interventions?
Right. So the idea is kind of to re-level the playing field back to what it should have been in the first place.
That's exactly what it is. And that, when we talk about why accommodations exist, we, really talk about things like the Americans with Disabilities Act, which basically states that people with disabilities should be judged, as you said, on a level playing field. They should not be hindered by whatever disability they have. They also shouldn't be having an advantage over other test takers. The way we know that they're not getting an advantage is we go through this assessment process and we determine that, in an objective way, there are certain issues that are hindering performance. And when we can see that, then we know that a person needs, as you said, re-leveling of the playing field, not to give it an unnecessary advantage, but to let them compete fairly. And that's always what it's about.
Could you walk us through a little bit of what that assessment actually looks like in detail?
Sure. So it gets a little bit, there are a few things that can change about it depending on what the issue ends up being. But essentially what we do is we assess a person's cognitive ability. And what that means is we look at their intellectual strengths and weaknesses. Now, it doesn't matter if you have a genius level IQ or high average IQ or a normal IQ in the average range. Everyone's going to have different areas of strength and weakness. So we want to find out, how do you learn? What's the best way for you to process information? And do you have the ability to be able to perform at a certain level on a test like the LSAT, which is reading intensive? So that cognitive assessment establishes a baseline where we see, okay, this is a level that a person should be able to perform at when they're taking a test like the LSAT. And then if we give these other achievement-based tests where we look more specifically at academic functioning, reading is something we look at a lot with the LSAT because it's very reading intensive. If we see that there are discrepancies and certain patterns of results, then that lets us know that a person might not be able to perform to the level that their cognitive ability suggests. So we give tests of cognition, tests of achievement. In the case of an ADHD evaluation, then we give a specific test that just looks at attention. And then in the case of an anxiety or depression type of issue, we give an additional test that looks just at that. So, it can vary a little bit, but that's a typical evaluation process that I described.
Well, it seems fair and it makes a lot of sense. You brought up earlier the Americans with Disabilities Act, which I'm really glad you raised because, of course, that is the centerpiece of where these accommodations come from in a way. And also LSAC themselves, the Law School Admission Council, has had some issues with them over the years in terms of granting accommodations. I'm wondering if you could share about what changes you've noticed during your career as LSAC has kind of changed how they handle the accommodations process given these kinds of lawsuits.
Well, that's a good point you're making. I've been doing this type of testing for 12, 13 years, and so I have seen a big change. Um, Within, let's say, 8 years ago or something, that was still the time when uh, I felt on my end of it that LSAC was being really unfair to people, that people would come with, substantial need, substantial deficits. And, they were almost denying everyone, not everyone 100%, but they were denying a large sample of people that really should not have been denied. And then since that time, they were successfully sued. And you brought up an important point. They actually have made a lot of changes. Um, I can't speak to the changes that they've made um, on the whole. I can just say what it looks like on my end. What it looks like on my end is that they've become much more fair, and that when a person does come in and they have a thorough evaluation that's done in a comprehensive and thoughtful way, if those results show that there's impairment, they're pretty fair about judging that now, at least from what I can tell. Now, having said that, I'm also aware that they had the ability to have their consent decree lifted, which would mean that the federal government would not be involved in this process of oversight, and it was determined that it should not be lifted. So they may still be engaging in some kind of uh, bias when they look at some people's evaluations, but as far as what I can tell, they've become much more fair and even-handed over the years.
Yeah, I would imagine that as they've been sued and as the federal government has gotten involved, that the number of people or the percentage of people taking the LSAT with some sort of accommodations has probably increased over time. I'm imagining that there's probably not a lot of data out there on this, but I'm wondering if you have a sense of what percentage of people might be getting accommodations for this sort of test, or maybe is that something that you would not even have a clue about that sort of thing?
Yeah, I definitely don't know the answer to that question. And I think the reason I don't know is because, to my knowledge, that's not a publicly available piece of information. I know that the SAT will say, for example, the percentage of students that get accommodations out of the general population, but they themselves won't even say what percentage of people get approved to ask for accommodations. So I think a lot of these testing um, services, they probably like to keep people a little bit in the dark about that, and they're careful about what stats they release.
Is there anything that you might be able to share on your end in terms of what percentage of people who walk through your door you think are worthy of accommodations?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think by the time they come to me, usually the way they come to me is they either have a pre-existing issue that they're already aware of, that they're getting treated for, or a lot of times they might come from a tutoring service. So, for example, a tutor might come to them and say, it looks like you're having trouble here. You're really working much more slowly than expected. You should be improving, and it doesn't seem like you are. So some of those people could get referred to a person like me, and in that case, I already have some idea that there might be a problem going on. And then what I do is I conduct a phone screening where I ask a person a bunch of different questions about what their concern is, what kinds of issues they're having, and I'll ask questions about their life history. So by the time they get to me, I already have some idea of what's going on. And, and then by the time they come in, we go into the issue in an in-depth way. And I could say the vast majority of people that I see are people who really do require intervention and do require help. And many of those people get approved from LSAC for those kinds of interventions. What I will say is there are some occasions where a person might come in and I see that their test scores are not really adding up to something that would lead to an accommodation or would substantiate that. And in those situations, I just tell the person as soon as that becomes apparent that it's not likely to be approved based on what I'm seeing. And then after that, it's their decision about whether they want to continue or not. But, I try to be really transparent and open about the process so that people know that, there's no guarantee of anything. I'm not able to tell them before they walk through the door what their chances are of getting approved. I can only do that after I see the test scores. But, I don't want to put anyone in a position of doing all of the testing and having me write a full report only for me to say, your scores don't add up to anything. So, as soon as I figure that out, I let them know. And so there's no surprises.
Well, that seems very reasonable and very fair. Before we wrap up, and I'm so appreciative of your time here, I'm wondering if you could just lay out a little bit of what sorts of accommodations students might be able to get if they are approved, aside from let's say extra time, for example. What other things can they get?
Well, it really depends on what the issue is that's plaguing them. So, for example, let's say you have a person with ADHD, and this person is pretty inattentive, and they're distractible, and they have trouble sitting still, and they have trouble sustaining energy over time. A person like that would probably want to have more time. A person like that would probably need to have either a private room or what would be known as a semi-private room, where they might take the test with a few people in the room instead of a huge room with lots of other students. They might be able to have things like earplugs, things like, headphones that cancel out sound. They might have extra breaks. If you're someone that can't sustain energy and stamina over time, you might need to have breaks so that you're able to perform at or close to your best during the whole test. And depending on how much extra time they need, sometimes the test can get divided into segments also. If you're someone that really runs out of energy or runs out of steam basically by the end. So those are the different kinds of things that you're likely to see. Someone who's taking medication could expect to be approved to have the ability to take the medication in with them. I've seen people that have had things like diabetes and they've needed to eat or have insulin injected, and they're very agreeable with those kinds of accommodations to give those people breaks to let them inject or let them test their blood sugar and let them eat and let them wait until their blood sugar rebounds to a steady level. So I think the key is anything that can really be proven in an objective sense, in a thorough way that meets all of their criteria, they're reasonable about approving those things. And it could be a lot of different types of accommodations. It's just something that has to be proven. And so I think a lot of people who get denied by LSAC probably get denied because they've not submitted a comprehensive evaluation, or there have been mistakes made. And, we don't want to conflate mistakes being made or a non-comprehensive evaluation with LSAC being unfair. Because what I think is when it's done properly, they tend to be fairly even-handed.
Right. So it sounds like in a lot of cases, it's just the student has to have the proper expectations that the process will take a while to hear back from LSAC. And so they should start early and get all their documentation in order in case they may need anything additional later. Is that something you typically run into?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely important. I think they take only a couple of weeks to get back to people. So it's not a crazy amount of time or anything. I definitely see people who come, on the last day right before the deadline, and they have to, as long as you get it in by the deadline, they have to evaluate those just as they have to evaluate someone who gets it in a month before the deadline. But if you're someone that has a complicated case and you have to be submitting other kinds of medical records or things like that, you want to be able to think about that ahead of time. So for someone with more of a physical issue, or someone that has a complex issue where maybe there is a mental or emotional issue, and there's also something like, let's say carpal tunnel syndrome, you're going to want to have your paperwork in order. You don't want to start seeing your doctor for carpal tunnel syndrome 2 days before. You're going to want to have that planned out. But my understanding is they have they're offering the LSAC much more frequently now. So if a person misses one deadline, they can wait a month and get another one.
That is very true. And that can also reduce the anxiety quite a bit because you know that there's always another test date just around the corner in a month or two.
Right. That's true.
Well, this has been extremely informative. I appreciate your breaking things down so thoroughly and simply for everyone. Would you do us the favor to share the best way for folks to reach you if they're interested in accommodations or if they have questions related to it?
Well, sure. So I'm reachable through email, JMALOFF, like Frank, jmaloff@hotmail.com. They can call me, 310-712-5480. And I'm available and willing to help people that have questions and all kinds of needs.
Great. Well, thank you so much again for taking the time. I'll include those details in the description for this episode. Thank you again for joining us.